As you recall, last week I told you we were going to start a series of lessons that deal with a single topic, but they're going to be three very different lessons. As a matter of fact, we're not going to get to the main character of these lessons until the end of this session today. But I want to show how this character was built up, and hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll be able to point out why this is probably one of the most important people. As I was saying to Gretchen, without him we forget about the Bible because we probably wouldn't have had it.
Whoa.
And or not in the form that we have it. We were talking last week about the Shiloh priest. We're talking about the city of Shiloh as being a significant part of the history of the Israelites. It's a significant part because apparently this is one of the first places that we have in the biblical history that indicates that the people were worshiping in some orderly fashion. And last week we looked at the story involving the birth of Samuel, how his mother had prayed for a boy. She had a baby boy, named him Samuel, and dedicated him to the temple. And he went to the temple when he was still a boy, maybe 4 years old. And he remained a part of the temple for the next 40 years.
Oh, wow.
Now, if you recall what we went through last week, what happened 40 years after the time of the birth of Samuel, and that is that the Israelites were in a war against the Philistines. And they were defeated in that war. And in that war, they also had a very significant thing happen, namely that the ark was taken from them and the Philistines had control of the ark. We talked about that last week. You can look at that on the screen if you want.
Okay.
I also made mention of the fact that something else that was significant is that for all practical purposes, Shiloh was emptied out. And people left Shiloh. Among the people that left Shiloh were the Shiloh priests, and I'll talk about that much more later, and this man Samuel. Samuel left, and after I'll say what happened after that. What happened with Samuel? Samuel judged in Israel all the days of his life. That's exactly what the Bible says. He took from the time about 70 until about the time he died, about 40 years that he was there. He went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would go back to Ramah, for his home was there, and there he administered justice to all Israel. There he built an altar to the Lord. This is right from Samuel, from the book of Samuel. Here is a picture of Samuel the prophet. Here is an abbreviation of what Samuel did. Well, as a judge, for the most part, he was quite successful as a leader of the Israelites. That's kind of an interesting thing to think about because they had no other appointed leader. They didn't even have a high priest. The sons of Samuel do not measure up to the standards set by their father, and it became very apparent to a number of people that these two sons that he had were not going to be able to follow in his footsteps and do the sort of things that he had done. For example, there is one chapter in this part of Samuel where it talks about the success that Samuel had in building an altar at the proper time to cause the defeat of the Philistines. It's a very interesting chapter. With these sons not being successors, the people started to ask for a king. Can we not have a king like other people? Cannot we have a leader that we can depend on? And that's what we're going to look at today, the idea of the leader. Now, the next chapter, I think this is the map. This is the circuit. This is where Samuel came from. Here's Shiloh, and here are the cities that he visited regularly. Bethlehem is right down about here. And so there's every reason to believe that Jesse's family, which means David's family, might very well have had contact with Samuel. I think that's significant in other parts of the story. Chapter 8 deals largely with one thing: why you don't want to have a king. Chapter, I think it's chapter 8. Yeah, chapter 8. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to list them all, but he will take your sons. He will appoint himself commander. You'll take your daughter. You'll take the rest of your fields. And I'll go on and on with this. There's the rest of that. But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, no, but we will have a king over us. So Samuel beseeches the Lord, and he is told to look for a king. He is told that he will find a king. And he'll find a king somewhere in the tribe of Benjamin, which is rather strange because Benjamin was the least of the 12 tribes at that time. But he will find a king there. We are told the story that there was a man there by the name of Kish who had a son whose name was Saul. Kish lost a couple of his donkeys, and Saul is out looking for those donkeys. And here's Saul asking some women, have you seen my donkeys? Mm-hmm. Well, if you haven't seen my donkeys, have you seen the seer? S-E-E-R. That is another name for prophet. In other words, have you seen anything of Samuel? Maybe Samuel can tell me something about where my donkeys might be. With Samuel, what happens is that he does find Samuel, and Samuel informs him that he will be the next king. That surprises him tremendously. Surprises him a lot, because he did not have any aspirations toward this. He did not think that he should be king. But he was a rather outstanding individual. It says a head and shoulders taller than anybody else. And what Samuel does almost immediately is anoint him as the new king. Now, he does not immediately become king because there has to be some establishment of the fact that he is the king. As a matter of fact, here's a picture of Saul hiding at the time that the tribes had been brought together, and Samuel was making a show of trying to pick a person out of those 12 tribes who should be the new king. They finally ended up with the tribe of Benjamin, ended up with Saul. But Saul couldn't be found. He was hiding in the luggage. They got two pictures of Saul hiding in the luggage. He didn't want to be seen. But he was taken up immediately and made king.
About how old was he?
He was about 30 years old at that time. He was about 30 years old. Here is a map of Israel. Now, what I want to point out here is that in this history, this biblical history, the historian is not interested in what I call scientific history. Remember I talked about that last week, where we deal with exact dates, exact numbers, and exact places and all that. Much more interested in something else, and that is to point out something concerning the relationship that these people had with their God. In particular, the type of relationship they had relative to the book of Deuteronomy. Now, these histories are called the Deuteronomic Histories. And 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings are about as close as we're going to find anywhere, telling us something about the history, the scientific history of the Israelites, but it's told in terms of following the idea of the Deuteronomic theology and trying to tell the story that there's a relationship that these people had with their God. And that relationship was simply this. I'll briefly state what the whole book of Deuteronomy is about. The book of Deuteronomy is about Moses just before the Israelites crossed over the Jordan River, spoke to the people and said, this land is your promised land, and it will be yours as long as you obey. If you are a righteous people, you will be able to inherit this land. If you are not, you will not inherit the land. Now, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead. Most of these histories were written at the time when it became very apparent of one thing. You know what that was? They had not been a righteous people because they were about to go into captivity into Babylon. And so we see that showing up very often in these stories. It shows up very nicely in the stories of these kings. Here is a map that shows where Saul grew up, Gibeah. This is where he grew up. And he all of a sudden manages to get a certain amount of notoriety because of something that he does at Jabesh Gilead. Well, what had happened is that the people in Jabesh Gilead had been told by, there's Jabesh Gilead, way up here. Here's Gibeah. This is where Saul was living. This is Jabesh Gilead. And if I think I have a slide that says that the Ammonite king at that time told the people in Jabesh Gilead, "You will pay up in 1 week. If not, I'm going to gouge out your right eye, so we'll know who you are." And that word got to Saul. That word got down to the people way down in Benjamin. And Saul managed to try to get an army together. What he did, it says he cut up 2 calves and sent pieces of meat to all 12 tribes, and was able to get together a small army of 300,000 people.
Oh, wow.
Like I said, you do not pay too much attention to the numbers. What he did do, however, is he did go up to Jabesh Gilead, and he fought against the Ammonites, and he defeated the Ammonites. Now the question, why did he bother to do that? You have to go back to the book of Judges, and you find out that at one point, the men in Benjamin had lost everything, including their families, and they had no wives. And the way they were told is to find wives somewhere else. And they found only one city that had not pledged not to give wives to the Benjaminites, and that was the Jabesh Gilead. So they went to Jabesh Gilead, and guess what? A bunch of women were taken back to Benjamin.
Oh.
Very likely the reason that Saul went up to Jabesh Gilead was that was where grandma came from. That's where his family had come from. And so there was a relationship that he had with Jabesh Gilead. And anyway, he was very successful. And that success resulted in this. And and so all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. So he had done the right thing, and he was very successful, and it looked like he was going to be a successful king. One of the first things that Saul gets involved with his son is a battle at Michmash. Michmash is right in this here's Bethel, and here's where Saul is. This is right near Jericho, right near Jerusalem. And what Samuel tells Saul, you're going to be able to win this battle, but wait for me to come, and we'll make a sacrifice to the Lord. It says that Saul waited for 7 days, and he got impatient, and he made the sacrifice himself. That is Samuel. The way Samuel was pointing at him, said, look, you're great. He said, he's doing what? He's chastised him. You did not follow what you had been instructed to do. You made this sacrifice early. You disobeyed the Lord. That's item number 1. Then number 2. Then Samuel said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you king over them. Now, therefore, hearken to the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what Amalek did in opposing them on the way when they came from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek. Those are my boldness. Utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman and infant and suckling and ox and sheep and camel and ass. In other words, completely destroy it. That was the order that came from Samuel. We find Samuel, this is a battle that followed. We find Samuel coming up there later. And what does he see roaming around? Sheep. Mm-hmm. Here's sheep baying in the background. He sees all evidence of all these cattle around. He realizes, when I saw this picture the first time, I thought of a thing that Saul might have said if Samuel said, "What about all these sheep?" And Saul should have said, "What sheep?" How many of you know the classic joke in that regard? Yeah. The man that walks into a party with an elephant. And somebody says, "What you say? What's we're doing with that elephant?" He says, "What elephant?" Incidentally, you can find several editions of that cartoon on YouTube. Obviously, what we find here are evidence of the fact that, again, he did not obey. Mm-hmm. He did not obey because he was told to utterly destroy everything. Samuel rebuked Saul for this. One of the things he was supposed to do was to kill the king of the Amaleks, and he did not do that. Who does kill him?
Sam.
Samuel himself picks up the sword, and I think I have 2 pictures of him killing actually beheading the king. There. 2 instances now of what? Of something that we are told in the book of Deuteronomy to look out for. When he was a righteous man going up against the Ammonites and Jabesh Gilead, things went well. When he disobeys, well, now what's going to happen? What is true about the rest of Samuel's life? It is all pretty much downhill. Let's take a look at what happens next in the Bible. Right after that situation where Samuel had to kill those people from Amalek, we find about David. We are told that Samuel went out immediately to find a new king. He was instructed to find a new king. I have a lot of pictures of the shepherd boy, and Samuel anointed David. You all remember the story. We won't go into the details of it. I won't go into a lot of details of David's life because I assume that everybody is quite familiar with it. But Jesse is the father of David. Jesse has a number of other sons, all who are men, none of whom Samuel picks, but picks the boy that was out in the field, the shepherd, namely David. So David is anointed king. Now, I think this is in chapter 14 or 15. The next thing we read about is this. We read that David, as a boy, probably of 16 years of age at that time, he was anointed when he was about 12, confronts Goliath. Is there anybody here not familiar with that story? Probably one of the most familiar stories in the human race of the success that he had against Goliath. He destroys Goliath. Well, I'm going to go back here. Destroys Goliath. Then we get one of those things that indicates that there were different people that were supplying information to whomever was writing this history, because we get 2 stories. We find out that Saul asked the question, who was this that killed Goliath? And he is immediately introduced to David, and he encourages David to come and live with him, come to the palace, and become one of his bodyguards. Now, the reason I mention that is that if we take a look at the story of David, we find out that somewhat earlier, David was summoned to the court of Saul to do what? To play the harp. It says that it would soothe Saul when he heard the proper kind of music. And a number of different pictures that I have of Saul being entertained, but this is the one I like especially. Here is David playing the harp. In the background, we see one person. There is another person here. These 2 people probably are Michal, one of Saul's children, a daughter, and Jonathan, who later became the close friend of David. But we find Saul playing the harp. Now, the way it's written in the book of Samuel, David shows up at the court playing the harp before the Goliath story. Then why did not Saul recognize the harpist when he was introduced to the man that we don't really know? We say this is one of these things that indicates there might have been 2 different stories that were being told. What we find is that in that period when David is in Saul's court, David is very successful. As a matter of fact, it may be a period of almost 7 or 8 years that David is working as a bodyguard for Saul. And every time he's sent out, he has tremendous success. He has such success that the people start to recognize him, although he's nothing more than a bodyguard, one of the troops for Saul. But we have a picture here of women singing. Here's another one, women singing. And what are they singing? And the women sang one another as they made merry. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me only thousands. Saul became quite jealous. Now, I'm going to make a suggestion here, and that is that we have a chicken and egg situation. He became so jealous that there's every indication that he became insane, and he behaved like an insane person. The question is, did this obsession that he had with David make him insane? Or was he insane and that caused him? I don't know. It's hard to say. But it is a rather interesting thing that we find the book of Deuteronomy coming into play, because what happens? Everything starts to go downhill for Saul. Success at the beginning when he's obedient, downhill when he's not obedient. To the point where Saul actually attacks David. At one point, when David is playing the harp, Saul throws a spear at him, and actually you might say tries to kill him. And he wonders what to do about this situation. He comes up with a solution. When David slew Goliath, Goliath had promised his daughter in marriage to whomever would slay Goliath. Well, David was at the most maybe 16 years old, and this girl was considerably older than that. Her name, I think, was Merab, M-E-R-A-B, and she was married off to somebody else. But there was another daughter, this Michal. And I pointed out in that one picture, it may very well have been Michal that was standing by the harp when David was playing the harp. And Saul offers Michal to David as his wife. Now, actually, this is kind of interesting, because Saul had another thing in mind. He wanted to get rid of David. He says, this can be your wife, but you're going to pay a dowry. And Saul's servant spoke these words in the ears of David and said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and no repute? And the servants of Saul said to him, thus and so does David speak. Then Saul said, thus you shall say to David, the king desires no marriage except 100 foreskins of Philistines, that he may be avenged for the king's enemies. So Saul sought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. That's not a bad idea. You go up against 100 Philistines and manage to take their foreskins, then you can marry. What was Saul hoping? By the time he got to 56 or 7, somebody would kill him, and he'd be able to get rid of David in that fashion. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David arose and went along with his men and killed 200 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become his son-in-law. And here we have a picture of David bringing a sack full of the foreskin. I had another picture of David at the time of the slaying of the foreskins, and there was blood all over the place. For some reason, I could not get it onto the PowerPoint. I don't know. So I did not put it on. But the ploy of Saul simply did not work. How am I doing time-wise? Yeah, didn't work. Saul devised other ways. I'm going to have to kill him. So what he did is get some assassins to come into the bedroom of Michal and David and kill David. Somehow or another, Michal gets word of this, and she warns David, "You better get out." This is one of the most famous pictures that we have in all the Bible stories of Michal helping David escape, to get away, to leave, and flee. As a matter of fact, we have a little bit more to the story in that when they come in to kill David, the two assassins that we see right here, these two assassins are told to look in, are told, that's David sleeping there. Does anybody remember a couple weeks ago I mentioned this was nothing but one of the household gods, and then they put a goat skin for hair, and so they left, and David escapes. Well, what did David do? What do you think David did? He went to Samuel. As soon as he could, he went to Samuel and said, what do I do now? What's the next thing to happen? Actually, there's a little bit more to the story, and I won't go into the details of it, but some other people joined with him in protecting David, and Saul got wind of this, and Saul sent some people to still assassinate David. When they got near those people, they all started to prophesy. That meant they started singing and celebrating. And that upset Saul, so he went himself and he started to prophesy. And David escaped. David escaped, and I do not have any slides on this next part because, again, it's a very familiar part, and that is the friendship between David and Jonathan. Very close friendship. And you remember the story of Jonathan shooting an arrow, telling David if the arrow goes too far, you must flee. If it stays close, you can stay. Jonathan finds out from his father, finds out from Saul, that Saul still has every intention of killing him. And so David has to flee. And David then flees. And David then fled from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. Now what is Gath? Gath is a Philistine city. He went to the king of Gath, and the servants of Gath said to him, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not say one to another, sing of him in dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And David took these words to heart, and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath." I hope I have this next slide. David feigns madness when he's in the Philistine court. Here them trying to restrain David. Here's the king of that time. I think a slide here. So David changed his behavior before them and feigned mad in their hands, and made marks on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, "Lo, you see this man is mad. Why, they have brought them to me. Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to play madman in my presence? So this fellow come in?" In other words, David was able to fool Achish into believing that he was mad. What's David going to do next? And David departed from there, escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard of it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became a captain over them. And they were with him there were with him about 400 men. I think I have a picture of the cave. This is the best picture I could find of the cave. But what was happening is that all of a sudden there were enough people that recognized that David was different. His family certainly would, but a lot of other people. And they decided, hey, I want to go with David. And they would go with David. And all who were distressed all were distressed or indebted or discontented rallied around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. From there, David went to Mizpah of Moab. When he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and mother stay with you until I learn what God will do for me." And he left them in the care of the king of Moab and stayed with him the whole time that David was in the stronghold. Anyone want to try to interpret that? Why did he take him to Moab? Who was David's great-grandmother? Ruth the Moabite. And if we go back to the story of Ruth, we find out that Ruth married Boaz. Boaz had a son, I can't remember what his son's name. And then there was another son, Jesse, who was the father of David. So David had relatives in Moab. And he thought, I better protect my family. If Saul's out after me, he may go after my family as well. So what he did was to protect his family in the best way that he could by getting them out of the country and sent away. Now, there's another thing that had happened that was kind of curious. I think I got this a little bit straight. David finally had to leave the cave of Moab, and he decided what he would do is go to Nob. Now, what was in Nob? Now, I mentioned this a week or so ago. When the city of Shiloh was defeated by the Philistines, there were a number of people that were priests that were not high priests. The high priest was Eli and his two sons. But there were a number of priests of Shiloh that figured, hey, we better get out as well. And they did. They left and they went to Nod. Now Nod was a little city, a little village not too far out of Jerusalem, which was not too far from what? From Bethlehem. It's not too surprising then, if David and his family had been influenced by Samuel, that he would have known about the priests of Nod. And when he was trying to find refuge, he would go to the priests of Nod and see what he could do about that. When he was at the priests of Nod, he told them a story. He said he was on a special mission for the king, which was not the case. And he said, I don't have anything. I've come here without a sword. And what we have here is a very important part of that biblical history, and that is the high priest, or the chief of the priests of Nod at that time, was a man by the name of Abimelech. And this is Abimelech giving the sword to David. Here is the high priest. Remember that's next week. I'll be talking about the ephod and all that. Take a look at the breastplate here and take a look at the apron that he's wearing. These are indications that this man was a high priest and is giving the sword to David, the sword of Goliath. Look at that picture very carefully. You see something else? This character here.
Yeah.
This character was in the background and he saw all these things happening. This happened to be a guy by the name of Doeg, D-O-E-G, Doeg. Doeg was actually an Edomite who worked for Saul. Actually, he was Saul's herdsman. He was a very important official in Saul's entourage. Doeg sees what? He sees the high priest giving David the sword. Let's see one second. Okay. I skipped a few slides here. I didn't make a few slides. What happens that David becomes an outlaw? He leaves Adullam. He leaves that cave. It's too easy to find him there. He becomes an outlaw. And Saul asks of his entourage, where is David? I want to kill him. And nobody would answer. Nobody would say anything, except this man Doeg. And Doeg says that I saw the priests of Nod giving that sword to David. Maybe the priests of Nod know where David is. What Saul did was invited all the priests of Nod to come to his place in Gibeah at that time. Come to this place, and there he quizzed them. They admitted they did not know anything about the fact that David was wanted by the king. David had not told them that. But guess what happens? Saul reaches the conclusion, you helped David, therefore you're going to die. And he said, all right, let's have them put to death. Nobody would lift a sword. And so the king gets into the guard who stood there, turn and kill the priests of the Lord because of their hand with David. And they knew that he had fled, and he did not disclose it to me. But the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the board. Then the king said to Doeg, you turn and fall upon the priest. And Doeg, the Edomite, turned and fell upon the priest, and he killed on that day 85 persons who wore the ephod. So this man, Doeg, does become a rather significant person in that regard. Here is a picture of him killing one priest after another. Saul standing in the background, his men not wanting to lift a sword in the least bit. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. And David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day when Doeg, the Edomite, was there, that he would surely tell Saul, and I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. David took upon himself the responsibility that he might have been the one that caused the death of all these priests, because he should have recognized that Doeg was nothing but trouble, and it was true. But it does something else. He says, I think I got that another slide. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priest. And David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day, I read that already. David says, stay with me and fear not, for he that seeks my life, seeks your life. With me you shall be in safekeeping. So what we find is that this one son, he manages to escape. He is part of the priesthood of these priests of Nod, and he comes with David. Do we hear anything more of Abiathar? Abiathar and David are together for the rest of David's life. And they are very close together the rest of David's life. And Abiathar plays a rather significant role in many aspects of David's life. Now, that's all that I have in terms of slides. I want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to get into next week so that we can see why this man Abiathar becomes so terribly important. David is still an outlaw, which means what? Abiathar is an outlaw. And what we're going to look at next week are the outlaw years of David with Abiathar. When those outlaw years are ended, David becomes what?
King.
David becomes king. He becomes the king of Judah. Now, how this comes about involves another rather interesting situation that David actually, for a while, is a part of the Philistine army. He's a part with the Philistines. But things happen that whereby we find that David does not act as a Philistine, but gets involved in a situation where Abiathar plays a rather significant role. I'll give you a little bit of a taste of this. When David is going with the Philistines, his town of Ziklag was sacked by the Amalekites. When David comes back, he finds out that his whole city had been destroyed and his wives and his children were all taken captive. Now, who told him what to do? He then went to, guess who? Abiathar. And Abiathar told David what to do. We'll take a look at that and what David did and the consequence of what David did that led to the fact that it wasn't long before we have a situation where David is in a position where certain things can happen that will lead to his becoming the king of Judah. And we'll talk a little bit more about it next week. And then eventually the king of all 12 tribes. And guess who was with him the whole time? Abiathar. And we find that Abiathar is, on several occasions, called in by David to bring the ephod so that he can make some prophecy as a priest as to what might happen. Abiathar is not insignificant. I hate to give the whole thing away, but the Abiathar is so terribly important because, and I mentioned this to Gretchen on the way to when David becomes the king, he tries to get the northern tribes to be involved with him. We'll talk about that. The northern tribes are involved with him, and David becomes the king of all 12 tribes. Not insignificant. All 12 tribes. You've heard me talk about this several times before. At this time, when he becomes king of all 12 tribes, he's still in Hebron. Being in Hebron, he's in Judah. He's in the south. It would be the same thing if the people at the time of the American Revolution decided we're going to stay right up here in Boston. Mm-hmm. And how would the people in the south have felt about that?
Yeah, right.
And what did the people in our history do? They moved to some place that was right in between. David said he's got to do the same thing. He did not follow American history. American history followed David. David did this many, many years before. He moved to the city of Jerusalem, and we'll have to talk quite a bit about what that city was. And I'll just give you one little hint of what else is going to come up. And that whole time that David was the king of the 12 tribes in Hebron, he was also the chief priest. Suddenly, when they moved to Jerusalem, Abiathar becomes a co-priest with another man called Zadok. He becomes associated, and we have two priests in Jerusalem. How this happened, we'll have to discuss this. What was the consequence? We don't know. Is there a possibility they would not always agree on everything? Yes. Is there a possibility they might agree on something? And we'll take a look at that rather strange relationship that existed in terms of that co-priesthood in Jerusalem involving this man Abiathar. Abiathar did not show up until the second of these 4 lessons, but he now becomes a center person. And we'll look at Abiathar, and next week, and we'll do away with him. And he will disappear. But when we get to the 4th lesson, we'll find out why Abiathar might have been such an important and significant part of what became the one thing that really set the Jews apart from the rest of the world. And what was that? Their book. They had the Bible. Yes. And how it was through Abiathar that certain things happened that led to the fact that we have so many things that are of significance in the Bible. I was going to hold this all until the very end, but it is such a good story to me of how Abiathar plays such a significant role, although he does not show up that much, just for a very short time. But his significance cannot be overestimated. Next week, then, it's going to, the title of the lesson next week is, guess what? Abiathar. And all the things that involved Abiathar. The end.